My very first trip to Africa was in college. I was an undergraduate, and I studied at the University of Nairobi and had a remarkable experience. For me, in many ways, life-changing. What I saw in Kenya and also in Uganda and Tanzania was literally, for me, breathtaking poverty, something that shook me to my core. I'll never forget my first time walking through Mathare Valley in Nairobi. Its seemingly endless slum fills low-rising hills, a mess of corrugated metal, dirt roads, animals, and people crowded in a constantly jumbling mass. It's difficult to imagine unless you live there or have been there. And while there is poverty in every nation on earth, including our own, the depth of poverty in the slums of the developing world is really unmatched. Mathare today is home to more than 500,000 Kenyans, and they live without running water, without sewers, without access to basic health care or education, adequate food, or any sort of public safety services. Homes are constructed really from garbage, from corrugated tin, from cast-off components of others' lives, and the stench of that slum is unbearable and unforgettable to all but those forced to live there day in and day out. You cannot, in my view, really know abject poverty until you've seen it with your own eyes and been confronted by its depth and by its painful persistence. That particular day I saw, and in the months that unfolded after that, my own faith was deeply challenged and shaped by the experiences that I had in Kenya. It changed the way I looked at my own country and at the economic disparities here and between here and the rest of the world. I saw something else, though, all across Kenya, in places where I worked, urban and rural, as a volunteer, both on that trip and when I returned subsequently, which was in striking contrast to the material poverty of the folks with whom I visited. And that was just an astonishing openness, kindness, gentleness, willingness to welcome and embrace strangers and visitors that was utterly unexpected and in some ways humbling. I remember my first church service in the Ngong Hills at a Presbyterian church. I grew up in a wonderfully suburban, somewhat frozen, chosen sort of church in Newcastle County, Delaware. And the service that I joined there went on not for an hour, not for 2 hours, not for 3 hours, but went nearly 4 hours, and was punctuated repeatedly with spontaneous demonstrations of joy that weren't just a few moments long, but turned into entire parades of the congregation through the whole village, dancing and singing and shouting hallelujah and praise to God. And at one point, a woman sitting next to me turned and said, "Are you a missionary?" And I said, "No, but if you've got any spare moments, I'd love it if you'd come and witness to the church where I grew up." We, in our incredible material wealth, desperately needed the intensity, the passion of their acceptance of and joy for God, something I had not ever seen in that same depth in my own community where I'd been raised. And that challenged my faith, that folks so poor in material wealth were so abundant in their love for God and in their willingness to welcome others. It was heartbreaking to me just how incredibly gracious and generous these people could be. Visiting once a family in a rural area when I was working with Wanawake wa Mandaleo, they, I learned, had slaughtered their very last goat in order to provide an adequate meal welcoming strangers from another country. And we were as three strangers arriving in Abraham's tent, something that for me had resonance with the greatest traditions of hospitality to strangers, to angels among us from the very most ancient of times. And it was just 5 years after these original experiences in Africa that I spent my time at the Yale Divinity School, and it helped me explore the questions that had been raised for me in the context of my faith. And I am thrilled tonight to be able to join with scholars and friends, with fellow alumni for this important dialogue concerning many of these same issues at the intersection of faith and poverty. I want to thank Dean Attridge and the other organizers for inviting me to participate, and the Press Club for hosting us this evening. Today is, of course, Ash Wednesday, and we stand tonight on the threshold of Lent, a season, hopefully, for all of us, in different ways, of reflection, of repentance, and of sharper focus. Lent should be a time when we consider the number and significance of our good works, of our open-hearted responses to God's calling and God's grace, and when we measure the seriousness of our sacrifice, which in many ways are the truest measures of ourselves. As I prepared for this visit with you tonight, I thought a great deal about that time now more than 25 years ago, when I first spent months in Africa, but as much about what happened to me after I returned to the U.S. as when I was actually there. In the 2 or 3 years following my initial return from Kenya, I was, shall we say, a constant reminder to everyone around me of the troubles facing that continent, whether they really wanted to hear it or not. Seeing the poverty of Mathare and other places in East Africa lit the fire of activism within me and drove me to become ceaselessly involved, as only the young really can, as an activist for human rights and for poverty relief. And I spent the last year of college and then 2 years afterwards dedicated to the fight against apartheid, first in Washington and then with the South African Council of Churches. And I then returned after that to Kenya and to Uganda to do some relief work with the Presbyterian Church before ultimately deciding, after a lengthy late-night conversation with a priest friend who is today the Bishop of Johannesburg, to return to the country from which I came and try and work individually to confront poverty at its most abject here. I went to working with the homeless in New York City and found in the homeless shelters of Fort Washington and of the 5 states where I went in the year that followed with the National Coalition for the Homeless, a similarly deeply challenging exposure to what abject poverty means in this richest of countries, but also incredibly challenging moments of grace, of profound witness, of closeness to what I believe to be the living God, the neighbor that we are called to but so often fail to really see in those who are all around us. It was my time at Yale that helped me understand the connection between my faith in God and the effect my experiences in Africa and with the homeless had in motivating me to work not just for charity or for relief, but for justice and reconciliation. While at Yale, I was a student intern, a pastor with the Downtown Cooperative Ministry in New Haven, one of America's poorest and most challenged cities. And it was an opportunity there for me to see a multi-faith congregation coalition working to try and address issues of housing and of homelessness in the context of a city that is also home to one of the nation's best endowed universities. It was after that time that I returned home to Wilmington, Delaware, and to the state where I grew up, and I chose as the place to worship an inner-city church that was not just actively welcoming to the homeless, but actually is today a full-time homeless shelter. A church, West Presbyterian, so dedicated to mission that it literally succeeded in spending itself out of existence. I served on the session and will not soon forget the day when our accountant and chief finance officer said to us, if we continue on the path we're on of relentless dedication to mission, we will close our doors in less than 5 years. And the session voted unanimously to continue. And today, the church is closed, and it's been repurposed as a homeless shelter, which was in many ways what it was initially intended to be, a place of grace and respite for those most troubled among us. We really can't predict the journey of our lives. We really can't imagine how things shown to us early on might someday come back to us as a challenge or an opportunity. The years I spent in Africa and working with the homeless in New York and elsewhere were things that I largely put aside. For the decade that I was raising 3 young children, working as in-house counsel at the Gore-Tex company, and then beginning to get involved in improving my local community. But ultimately, in my first elected role as county executive responsible for housing programs for 500,000 people, I returned to active and engaged work with Habitat for Humanity, with the faith community in Delaware, with a local government that had turned away from being engaged in providing safe, sanitary, and decent housing. And I found those early formative experiences came back powerfully and was a tremendous opportunity for me to work with the faith community in Delaware and with government, and to find effective relief for the poor through housing. I believe life for us is in fact a process of hearing, and at times ignoring, what God is calling us to do, and of discerning how best to act upon that call, whether as an individual or as a nation. And with the help of the guidance I received at the Divinity School, I think I've learned to recognize that strong and unique sense of fulfillment that comes by witnessing with and working with, in partnership, not in charity, those who suffer, whether individually, the homeless in this country, or an entire continent, and finding ways to forge a closeness with God through that. I hope many of you here know that same sense, that same unusual and profound feeling of getting out of the boundaries of our professional lives, of our roles, and instead seeing others as they truly are, as equal in creation. So in thinking about tonight, and in thinking about the onset of Lent, I realized that more than 25 years had passed since my first visits to Africa, and frankly, decades have passed since active personal engagement with the struggles, with the poverty of many of the developing nations of Africa had been an important part of my life. I spent, as I've mentioned, the last 10 years of my life raising 3 young children and helping build a business and helping grow a career. So it is wholly appropriate that tonight's event, like the title of the journal connected to it, is Reflections. And if you'll forgive me, I've been reflecting on the very circumstances that in a roundabout way seem, to some at least unexpectedly, to have led me from being the county executive of a small county in Delaware to being not just a freshman senator, but the newly selected chair of the Senate's Subcommittee on African Affairs. After 25 years of focusing on so many other avenues for service, I find myself unexpectedly drawn back to a place where work in partnership with the faith community on Africa, not in charity, but in partnership, is going to be in many ways the central call of my work in the next few years. As a person of faith, I find this striking, perhaps even providential. Interestingly, I began my day this morning at the Senate's weekly prayer breakfast, where Joe Lieberman gave moving reflection about the nature of Sabbath. He had an interesting comment. He quoted the Hebrew author Ahad Haman, who said, "More than the Jewish people has kept the Sabbath has kept the Jewish people." Just as the Sabbath provides observant Jews with a time for reflection, and much as Ramadan calls on Muslims to focus on fasting, prayer, and the pursuit of good works, Lent provides those of us in the Christian community with a chance to repent and reflect on the direction of our lives. On my way into the Senate buildings this morning from Union Station, I walked past a woman. It was just over 20 or so years ago I worked with Mitch Snyder on the issue of homelessness here in Washington. Some of you may remember Mitch. Now long gone, there is still a shelter here which bears Mitch's name. I last saw him literally the day before he became a victim of suicide, when he was testifying in front of the D.C. City Council in his usual passionate and endless way about the importance of dealing with the homeless. There is a woman who sits at the foot of the fountain in front of Union Station who has been there every day that I've come to Washington for 20 years. And I realized as a senator, I have walked briskly past her virtually every day of my last 3 months. Some of you know her. She has a face painted wildly in tiger stripes. She sits in rags and often actually smiles and greets folks who walk by her. Today, I stopped and said hello and simply tried to give her that moment of equality, of recognition, of someone who deserves my attention as I've taken from hers. It was a simple and small act of kindness, but Lent, I think, begins with such steps as these. A challenge towards basic human decency, to stop on the pathway that seems so set for us, so paved, so predictable, and to reflect on where we've gone perhaps a little astray. I've always been awed by Americans, by our stunning generosity, by our capacity to be lifted up out of our chairs by what we see on our televisions of the suffering of the farthest corners of the world, whether it's the disasters of the tsunami or the challenges of those in Sudan. Americans, in response to great natural disasters, are astonishingly generous. Hundreds of millions of dollars poured to Haiti in relief within hours of the worst earthquake in modern times. Yet I'm also overcome by our capacity for casual, almost brutal indifference to the suffering of those in the grips of abject poverty that we know exists in our world each and every day. Most Americans know that roughly 20,000 children die every single day worldwide from completely preventable diseases that just literally for pennies each could be cured. And we spend more as a people every day on soft drinks and video games than any of us individually do, or than we collectively as a nation do, on tending to the poor and on feeding the hungry and the homeless around the world. So I think my challenge as a freshman senator is to not ever forget, as I have at times forgotten over the last 25 years, the challenge of the poverty I saw before me in Mathari, the pathway that I saw through it, and the challenges that I see for us today in the United States. The power of Lent, I think, is that it is a moment for us to change direction. We as a country, we as a global community of those dedicated to seeing others as neighbor and caring for them have made real progress. The Millennium Development Goals give us a measurable way to say that we have made progress. But we also, at this moment, have to stop and reflect and say, it is not yet enough. We are called, we are challenged as an exercise of our faith to do more, to be more engaged, to be more persistent, to not forget, and to not turn back. Every major faith tradition teaches that it is our calling, our challenge, not just to see those who are poor among us, but to prefer them, to act for them. From Isaiah to Luke, from the Quran to the Torah, there are passages that challenge each and every one of us, regardless of your tradition or background, to put not just some time aside for the poor, to act not just in charity, but in a way that focuses on justice, on reconciliation, and on development. I'm conscious of the passage of time and want to get to the panel. I have many more reflections in front of me, but I think it might be best for me to move for the reflections of the panel. I'm conscious that in North Africa today and in places around the world, there is a dramatic movement towards liberty, towards democracy, towards change in countries that have long sweltered under dictatorship. And I'm conscious that we can't really make sustainable progress in tackling poverty until we tackle development. And development is something that can only be tackled in partnership with people whose capacity to be free is supported by those of us who believe that as a free nation, we have a remarkable model to provide them. I do think that in the Senate at this moment, we have an enormous challenge. Just today on the floor, we voted down H.R. 1, which was the House Republicans' proposed budget. It makes dramatic and broad cuts in spending of all types, spending that would improve the security and the quality of life for our communities in the United States, and that would significantly cut our investment in aid and relief overseas. At a time when, frankly, far less than 1% of our total federal budget, less than $39 billion, is dedicated to foreign assistance, development, and relief. I think it's incumbent on all of us in the faith community and around the country to take a step back and to focus on the long term, on the consequences for our relationships with countries around the world and our relationship with ourselves and our faith if we were to turn aside from the path that most of the industrialized world has long been on with us, of seeking collaboratively to lift up those who we are called to consider as neighbor, not just here, but around the world. As I said, we as a nation have an amazing capacity to be selfless and to be engaged in meeting the real needs of others. And we similarly have a capacity to turn aside and to focus narrowly on ourselves. As we come out of the worst recession in modern memory, it is completely understandable that people all across this country have pressed back hard against commitments to foreign assistance, have questioned and challenged whether the United States government should be engaged in this at all. And some can say, as some will, that perhaps giving by the faith community is inevitably more effective, more sustained, and more positive than the sometimes self-motivated investments and contributions of the American government and the American people. In my view, that's a dialogue in which we must together be vigorously engaged. It is only by hearing broadly from the people of faith all across this country that the people of Congress, your representatives, and the folks in our administration can know the value that we place as a country in investing in hearing the call that comes from all of our religious traditions to view others as neighbors and to care for those neighbors as we would ourselves and to lift them, bless you, out of the abject poverty that so dominates the lives of literally billions of our fellow people. As this day for me draws to a close, I can't help but conclude by thinking about what the spirit of Lent has been teaching to me today. My day began with Senator Lieberman's comments about the Sabbath and the need for a moment of reflection and the real physical challenge of nearly walking past a homeless woman who's been in my path in different ways for much of the last 20 years. I move tomorrow to my service as a senator and the challenge of representing you in the fight to sustain engagement with the whole continent of Africa. I ask for your help as you go home tonight after this great panel reflects, digests, discusses, what small, concrete step will you take? On what path will you head? What very real investment or sacrifice are you willing to make to see those who suffer and struggle around the world not just as objects of charity, but as our very real partners in transformation, in development, in growth, in faith, and in peace? I hope we can begin that journey together. God bless you.